All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again today. I'm your host, Jason Brand, the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. And today we got our Freight Market Roundup. I think the jumble of that word is really just indicative of what is going on in the market right now. Oh my gosh, we don't have enough time. Let's put it that way. And our goal here is to get these shows in quick and digestible. So we've got conflicting goals. We've got too much happening, and it's got too much effects, and we don't have enough time to talk about it. So, I am really happy you all have been able to join us here today. And as I mentioned, the goal for this episode, we've got a show every single week. Every other week, we either have a guest on or we focus on a specific topic. The other weeks, we do our Freight Market Roundup. And it's really a good, clean, across the market view of all the big things that are happening in the industry. And really, how they're going to factor into pricing, how they're going to factor into processes, and much more. But, I can't really sugarcoat this. The big thing really happening in the market right now is, quite frankly, Trump. And it's his very aggressive approach to foreign policy. And so but anyway, let's take a step back real quick. So this morning, I had the pleasure of being able to attend the Automotive Symposium here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was hosted by the Grand Valley University and more specifically, the Van Andel Global Trade Center. And in the very first discussion of the morning, I had the pleasure to hear from Robert Young, who's the Vice President of Purchasing and Supplier Development at Toyota Motor North America. Now, he had a lot of just wonderful nuggets to say this morning. It was a fantastic chat. But one of the things that really stuck out, because we obviously had to talk about tariffs, was he reminded all of us, hey, don't have a knee-jerk reaction to all of the changes taking place right now. And in his words, he said, we don't know where we're going to land yet. Make sure you're not making decisions without having an idea of where that landing is going to be. So, and what I can confirm is that the shipping industry, the shippers, we are indeed having a knee-jerk reaction. But in our industry's defense, ocean liners specifically right now are finding themselves in the crosshairs. But a lot of just the shipping industry in general is also stuck in the crosshairs. So they kind of have to react or, take significant financial damages if they don't. So anyway, so let's kind of, we're going down a path here. So let's step back for a second. I'm going to quick run through the agenda. So on our Freight Market Roundup, the goal is to walk through the current ocean rates we're seeing in the Trans-Pacific, the Transatlantic, and we're going to talk about the Suez Canal shipping lane. There's a reason I mentioned that. I'll give you some insight into how rates have been trending, as well as what our team's predictions are for them, or where they're headed into the future. And also, I'll give you some factors that are influencing rates at the moment. So as I mentioned earlier, it is our goal to get these things in for you either during lunch or after lunch, but quick, easy, digestible, and we try to keep them under 10 minutes if possible. Some topics we just can't, so you can always find the recordings on Spotify, on YouTube, and many more. Reach out if you've got any questions. We'll be happy to help you. So let's get this show on the road. We're going to start with that Trans-Pacific lane. And for this lane, we're specifically looking at the shipments that are leaving Southeast Asia and China and headed into the U.S. West Coast. So right now, our customers are paying an average of $3,000 per 40-foot equivalent unit, or FEU, and that figure is actually down from $4,200, which is equating to more than a 28% drop in price since the second week of February. What is surprising to me about this is that rate is actually been on the decline pretty steadily since the beginning of the year. We actually saw the year we started out at 5,700 per FEU. Obviously, second week into February, we were at 4,200. And as of this week, we're down to 3,000. We had that 28% drop between 3,000 or 4,200 to 3,000. And then since the beginning of the year to that second week in February, we had a 26% drop. So it's been a very steady and very consistent drop in this rate. Now let's move over to our East Coast destinations before we kind of fully paint the picture here. So still heading out of China and Southeast Asia, but right now headed into the U.S. East Coast ports. And what we're witnessing here is the same situation, quite frankly. It's a consistent and it's a steep decline in our rates. So right now, our customers are paying an average of $4,050 per 40-foot equivalent unit, FEU. Now, that is down from $5,150 And that drop is equivalent to a 23% drop. Now that 5,150, that is the second week in February as well. Now, if you look since the beginning of the year, this week, the $4,050, it's down a total of 41% since the beginning of the year. Now, I mentioned this on the last ship show because we were already seeing, well, not the last ship show, but the last Freight Market Roundup. We were already seeing these 26, 28% drops on the last show. And, I reminded everyone, hey, this is a conventionally slow time of the year. It's obviously the start of the new year. We passed all the major holidays. We also passed Chinese New Year. It's just a little bit of a lull at the beginning of contract season. It's normal for rates to be a little bit lower. But what we're seeing here is much more extreme than what we're used to. And there's a lot of factors playing into this. I can't really spell it all out. We'd have to do an hour-long webinar, and I'd really like to come with some slides at a very minimum to kind of paint the picture. But, one big factor into specifically why the Chinese shipments are cheaper than they typically are is just the uncertainty around trade with China and the tariffs with China. So, Trump's latest tariff on March 4th is a extra 10% on the duties and goods. And that adds the 10% tariff that was doled out on February 4th. So these are cumulative. It's now 20%. And that, duty, it's not only 20%, it's still sitting on top of the tariffs of more than 25%, which were first or originally introduced back by Trump in his first term. And that's on more than $370 billion worth of U.S. imports. Now, when it comes to China, though, it's really important that we mention this. It's not only a Trump thing. So under the Biden administration, duties on Chinese semiconductors were doubled all the way up to 50%, and duties on Chinese branded electric vehicles were quadrupled up to 100%. And so the clear takeaway from this is that there is bipartisan support for tariffs on China. And if you've got a long-term sourcing strategy that involves Chinese goods, and I hate to say it this way, but unfortunately, Chinese owned or operated manufacturing, you at the very minimum need to have a plan B. So you can kind of ride these ebb and flows that we're going to see in policy, and you can have the best option. It's almost like a German utility room. You need to have multiple fuel sources so you can play the market properly. You need the same thing from your supplier base. And I hope everyone out there has backup suppliers in different locations, because particularly this year, as we're seeing, you need to have a list. And setting up a supplier does not happen overnight. So make sure you're starting that process now if you have not already. Now let's move on. Let's go over to our transatlantic shipments. We're going to start with the shipments that are leaving European ports and headed into the U.S. West Coast. Generally, we go East Coast first. This time, we're going to go West Coast. So Europe to U.S. West Coast, the average across our shipments. Now, the general trend that we've been witnessing out of Europe is actually very different from what we've been witnessing out of China and Southeast Asia. The trend out of Europe is actually stability when it comes to prices. Now, a word of caution, generally stability is a good thing, but be careful not to view this word necessarily as a positive one, at least at this point. And there's a couple reasons behind this. So the prices of the East Coast, they're not at their lowest point we've seen them in the past 12 months, but they're sitting right about 5 to 10% higher above the lowest point we've seen them in the past 12 months. And the concern we have here is we could really be witnessing an at cost point on these on these West Coast destined lanes. And I think this picture becomes a little bit more clear when you compare the unadjusted, not including inflation or anything else, rates from March of 2019 to March of 2025, this same week. So you're looking at a year before the pandemic to this week. So this week, our price average for our customers, remember, because we're doing this a little bit backwards, out of Europe into the U.S. West Coast ports, on average, across the destinations and across the origins, we had an average of $3,537. I'm making that very precise for a specific reason. So $3,537 per FEU. You go all the way back to March 2019, same week, the average was $3,497. So I don't think I need to spell it out to you, but a price increase of $40 per ocean container prior to the pandemic to after the pandemic, having 6 years in between, is just not a good thing. This lane its current rate has been just far outpaced by inflation, as well as there are so many new port operating costs that have been implemented since then. Having that same rate is a very bad sign. So, I know I did this a little bit backwards, and I'm going to keep it because we've done this the same way every week, and then I just flipped the equation. But what we're going to do now is we're going to move over to the European shipments that are heading into the U.S. East Coast ports. Now, currently, our customers are paying an average of $2,150 per FEU, and our price average, it really, on this lane with those destinations, U.S. East Coast, it has not changed for more than a month now. It's hovered within $10 to $15 of around the same price. And, that's also surprising because given those new cost pressures, particularly of operating in the East Coast ports, they saw substantially more expansions and dredging and just the ability to take larger vessels during the pandemic. All of that obviously has to trickle down to the costs of using the port, which it's not. We're not really expecting this rate to get much lower in the next couple months. So as a result, if you are holding off on shipments looking for a lower rate, stop, because it's just not, the likelihood is very low at this point. Now, I want to also mention this too. It has been over a month sitting at this point, $2,150. Remember, average, it's been wavering, but we've still seen a pretty steep price drop since the beginning of the year. So we still have seen a price drop of over 23%, just a little bit over 23% since January of this year. It's not substantial, definitely when compared to China and Southeast Asia, but it is significant in some way. Obviously, you get down to lower price points and percentages obviously don't equal as many dollars. So, but yeah. Now let's, one of the latest concerns that the shipping industry is grappling with at this moment, and it's really affecting not only, shipments coming out of Europe or shipments specifically coming out of China, but just shipments in general, just to the nature of the shipping lines, is this new proposal to tax Chinese built and operated ships that are calling at U.S. ports. So at this week, at the TPM 25 event, MSC, and just as a reminder, the ocean shipping liner, their CEO, Soren Toft, he took the stage and he was pretty blunt. He essentially beat around the bush a little bit, but his message was very clear. He basically said, if we can't pass on that port tax proposal directly to our customers, we are reducing our number of U.S. port calls just as the result. He used a couple great examples, and there's been a few really good breakdowns of this new potential port tax. And so what we're going to actually do is we're going to wrap all those together. We're going to do a full outline. That's going to be next week. I want to make sure I give it justice. I want to make sure I show both sides of this equation, the good, the bad, the ugly, the whole picture. So make sure you tune in same time next week to talk about that more. But it is right now really causing some ripples, and you do have to keep your eye on it. Now, we're going to keep this show going. We're going to get this show done, not on time, but close to on time. So let's talk about the last ocean shipping lane we talk about on this show. That is our formerly Suez Canal lane, potentially current Suez Canal lane. And that is our China and Southeast Asia to Europe lane. Now, obviously, this lane has been at the center of attention for a while right now, and it's kind of revolving around this soft reopening we've kind of been witnessing of the Suez. And, despite the substantially shorter transit time between the Cape, when you compare the Cape of Good Hope to the Suez Canal, rates on this lane, they really do not have a lot of room to fall any further than they are right now. Watch me say that and the prices will go down, but it's really highly unlikely. So this week, our customers are enjoying a very economical $2,700 per FEU to travel between Southeast Asia and China all the way over to the European ports. Now, that is roughly the same, and I say roughly, but roughly the same as they've been paying for over a month now. We've seen a lot more wavering in this lane than we've seen from the European ports going into the U.S. East Coast, but still sitting quite solidly at that $2,700 point. Now, another thing about this lane is this year actually started out much higher than we saw the Europe to the U.S. East Coast lane. Started off the year at the $5,000 price point. So what we're seeing here is almost a 50% decline up to date. But, as you kind of watched our rate trends over time, after we got kind of close to Chinese New Year's, really the prices just dropped off, and we've seen them kind of bouncing off that cost point or floor point. Now, speaking of soft reopening, Egypt's Suez Canal Authority Chairman Osama Rabi said on Sunday that more than 47 ships had been rerouted from the Cape of Good Hope to the Suez Canal since the start of February. But I think it's important to view this as more of a seizing the opportunity while it's available rather than shipping in the Middle East is getting back to a stable point. So there's a flip side argument. Jack Kennedy, he's the head of Middle East and North Africa country risk at S&P Global. He said in his one-year outlook that there remains a severe risk to vessels transiting the Red Sea. And he is expecting the ceasefire process to likely break down in the next 12 months and military operations to resume in Gaza. I think we've all kind of thought that the ceasefire was surprising. Obviously, all thankful for it, but very surprising. And there were still a couple selected military operations that happened despite the ceasefire starting. So the idea of this breaking down over the next 12 months, I think, is it's an easier assessment. Now, on the flip side of Jack Kennedy's statement, Chinese and Russian flagged carriers, they have been transiting in and around the Red Sea and the Suez Canal for months now. And, I guess it's surprising given what we've been seeing with the rest of the carriers. The Cape of Good Hope is just a very, very long route. I mean, the Suez does wonders to kind of cut that transit time down. But, I guess it is a surprise. Still, Houthi rebels said a long time ago they weren't going to target those vessels, and they seem to be holding to that point. Now, if the ceasefire falls through, we will see what will happen then. Anyway, really appreciate everybody for joining us today. Big thanks. And next week, we are going to talk about this new proposal to tax certain ships coming into U.S. ports. It's a lot. We're going to cover it, but just you don't even need to bring a notepad. Bring a inquisitive mind. Thanks so much. We'll talk again next week.